basically at the situation of food security in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're looking basically to see how we as a community of actors, both academia, civil society, governments, and the general population can come together to share ideas, to look at responses, to look at challenges, and to be able to tell basically how we can ensure that the society that we live in is able, each and every person in the society that we live in is able to have sufficient food to meet their dietary and other developmental needs. We have a panel. This webinar is organized in collaboration between the University of Nairobi, the Fiscal Studies Committee of the University of Nairobi, and the University of Nairobi Research and Development Department, and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. We're here to try to look at both the technical, legal, and financial challenges that we are facing as a society, as a community, as a country, as a region, on how to deal with the huge challenge of food security that has been brought about as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a rich panel to take us through this particular discussion, to also try to guide us on the discussions that we'll be having in relation to food security in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first speaker that we have, and we are blessed to have today, is Negese Bello, who works for the Food and Agricultural Organization. Bello is the Regional Coordinator for East and Central Africa Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Program. He's based in Kenya, and he has been, or is, a food security and agricultural expert that has worked in very many complex emergencies and protracted crises in Yemen, in South Sudan, in Darfur, and in Ethiopia. So he has a rich experience in the context of food security, and we'll rely on him to tell us what we are doing right, what we need to do better to ensure that each and every person has some form of food security in this critical time. Then we have Professor Jane Ambuko from the University of Nairobi, who is an associate professor and the head of horticulture unit at the Department of Plant Science and Crop Production at the University of Nairobi, also with a wealth of experience in the area of post-harvest science and technology, who will also be taking us through food availability and distribution, and why it's important that we don't waste or we ensure that food is not wasted or lost at this critical time. Thirdly, we have Dr. Sise, who is also an expert in food security, having studied and worked on the area of food security, and is currently the legal expert for the Food and Agricultural Organization in relation to food security. He will be talking to us on the legal aspect of food security and what we can have in place to ensure that as a country, in the legal and technical aspects, we are effectively provided for. Then we have myself, Dr. Nicholas Orago from the University of Nairobi School of Law, a member of the Fiscal Studies Committee, who has undertaken research in the area of food security, and I will be looking at the financial aspects of our response to the food security situation during this pandemic. Then we will have two discussants, Mary Ongore from the University of Nairobi and John Mwangi from NDMA, which is our governmental agency that's dealing with disasters and looking critically at the issue of food security generally in the Republic. So we have a rich panel of presenters and discussants. We welcome you, all of you who are joining this particular webinar. We ask that you participate and contribute substantively to the issues that we will be discussing, and to do so in a way that we can all be able to learn from this webinar. I'll request you to mute your speakers so that we are able to concentrate and focus on the presentation that is going on. Each and every presenter will have an opportunity to speak based on slides that have already been developed. Minutes. And then we'll have the discussants also having 5 minutes to respond to presentations that have been made. But as we continue with the presentations, I will request that if you have a question, that you direct that question to us, so that we can put them together and put those questions to the panelists as the first batch of questions that we have during the question and answer session. And it's important for us that you are actively listening and asking questions so that we have a robust discussion on issues of food security and the challenges that we have as a country as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we as a collective can actually meet these challenges to be able to ensure that our communities, our society, and our country manages to feed the population during this trying time of COVID-19. So I welcome all of you. Please mute your speakers, and if possible, mute your video so that we can mute your video, Dr. Chaga or somebody, please mute your video and your speaker so that we are able to start. So we'll start with the first presentation, and the first presentation will be presented by Belio, who is our expert from the Food and Agricultural Organization based in Nairobi. And his topic will be food security under COVID, technical and legal considerations with a focus on Kenya. So Belio, please, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you for this opportunity, to be part of, this panel and the discussion. I'll be trying, to be more specific because, the title that I've been given is a little bit, wider. But, there are also other speakers who are addressing the food security issue from the safety and also controlling the waste, and also from the economic side, Nicholas will address. So let me try to make my presentation, focusing on 4 key issues. Next slide, please, Valerie. Next slide. Okay. So the talking point, that I would like, all participants, would take from this discussion will be, we have to look into the current situation on the ground based on the background on the food security situation at the global, regional, and country level. So I'll talk about the current situation of food insecurity and the background, how it was coming, in the past. And the second, key point that I would like, to address and discuss will be and how the key drivers and shocks and hazards are having a multiple factors and effects on this crisis of food insecurity under the emergency context of COVID. It's not, COVID is not a standalone shock. So we are going to discuss on that. And the other important point is for any response and action, we need to have a very good information and evidence. So in that case, we need to have a very good monitoring mechanism on the risk factors, and we have to identify also the needs of the most vulnerable people on the ground. So finally, we have to get anticipatory action and also the response that would have in immediate and long term, but we have to be specific what we are addressing at this point in time. Next slide, please. So to come to the background, information on the global and regional level. So as you all know, we have around 135 million acute food insecure people across the globe. This is a report before the COVID-19 crisis, which was part of the global food crisis report. The 135 million people are in 55 countries, which is 17% of the total population, which is in IPC phase 3 and above. When we say IPC phase 3 and above, for those of you who are not congruent of the integrated phase classification issues, so which means that people under crisis and emergency and catastrophe are grouped IPC phase 3 and above. Out of the 135 million acute food insecure population, we have 71 million are in Africa, which is 32% of the total caseload in the globe. And out of that 71 million and 28 million people, which is 20% of the Africa caseload, is in our region, 6 countries of IGAD countries in the Horn of Africa: Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, the Sudan, and Uganda. It is really a big figure. And also, we should not forget, for us, although we are saying, IPC 3 and above are the critical, segment of the population under food insecurity, but we have to be also considerate also on the population under stress. We have around 35 million people under IPC phase 2. We call it, population under stress in our 5 IGAD, countries. This doesn't, comprise Uganda. So this is very important for us, to make, as the background of our discussion when we think about the impact of COVID on the food security situation in the region, and especially on the most vulnerable households. Another important point, for us to keep in our mind is we have 820 million people who are chronically food insecure due to chronic food insecurity and poverty across the globe. This is before the COVID-19 crisis. 820 million people are already under. So out of this 820 million, Africa took around 256 million are in Africa. In East Africa, we have around 133 million chronically food insecure. Look, we have 135 million people in acute food insecurity and 820 in chronic, and in our region we have 28 million in the 6 countries in food insecurity, and also we have 133 million people are chronically food insecure. All these groups are susceptible for the impact of COVID-19 epidemics or pandemic. To come to Kenya, and with the recent analysis that we have had with the Kenya Food Security Analysis Group, the NDMA-led and the DISCNO group and KFSSG, we have come, the total population will be 1.3 million people are under acute food insecurity phase 3 and above. For us, to consider the second, aspect of our discussion, how do we consider, COVID with the current situation on the ground? Sorry. Okay, so we have to consider the key drivers of food insecurity together with COVID. COVID is not the only shock or hazard affecting food insecurity or food security situation in our region. It is acting together with other shocks. You all know this region has been passing from crisis to crisis. Since 2007 and 2008, the global food crisis. In 2011, our region was exposed to drought across the whole East Africa region. After the drought, we have been facing floods were affecting most of the rural households. Following the floods, we're having also mudslides and effects for crop farmers and also pastoral communities. Just recently, even now at this point in time, we have a desert locust affecting our region, particularly this the Horn of Africa. With all these combined effects and the recurrence of hazards and vulnerabilities, the COVID-19 pandemic has arrived. So we have to see it as a multiple factor, and we have to see it as a bigger aggravating factor toward this affecting the food insecurity. How it's affecting the food insecurity or security situation, we have to look at it with a framework of food security analytical framework. For us, when we talk about food security, we are looking about the key elements and dimensions of food security. How COVID-19 and other hazards and vulnerabilities are being affected, the availability section of food security. How access to food security is being affected. How the utilization aspect of food security is being affected. So we have to look from this dimension. And the current situation on the ground is really complex. Some experts are talking, giving it a name, managing crisis within crisis. We are already managing the desert locust crisis, and now we are getting another COVID crisis, which even complicates the management of the desert locust crisis in countries where we have strong measures taken by government and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. So, if we understand the food security situation, if we understand the key drivers of food insecurity, but we have to have also a good understanding of what is information required in order to go for a response. I think in many countries, as you have seen across the globe, not only in our region, there was a panic in addressing the issue because COVID-19 is a health crisis, but many countries, government and stakeholders are trying to manage the economic crisis, not to go to food crisis, because we should not repeat the same mistake that was happening during the 2007-2008 the financial crisis, which resulted into the global food crisis. So to avoid that type of incidences, we have to monitor the risk factors and also identify the needs. How do we do that? Because the most important part that we have to do monitoring the situation on the ground is how the food system is functioning. Is there a disruption of the production system? Is there the processing system working? As a distribution system is functioning? Is the consumption pattern is also working? What about the waste? I think there will be a session, Dr. Jane will be talking about the waste. And we have to also clearly understand the rural and urban networks. And we have to have the special sectors in the country. Kenya specifically is really is an agriculture dependent economy. Sorry, can you please?
Continue, we can hear you. Please, if you're joining the call, please mute your microphone so that we are able to focus on the presentation, please.
So, thank you. When we do this data collection, information collection system, there should be a coordinated action. We have to have a coordinated action from different stakeholders. We have many agencies and organizations going to collect data and information. But for food security in this country, under this difficult situation of COVID-19, we have to identify the impacts on the crop production, from the supply side. We have to have also, we should not also forget the livestock sector, which is also will be affected. I'm not saying it's affected, but will be affected, and we have to identify the key value chains in that system, which one is affected or not. So we have to have also good understanding because of all these restriction measures that has been applied in many countries, not only inside particular country, but in neighboring countries. We have to have how to handle the input availability, the supply, and also how the products come into the market. The most important point that we have to consider is also mapping the most vulnerable groups. Oh, come on. So we have to understand and map the most vulnerable at-risk households. This is really very crucial and important. Sometimes we are addressing areas that we know, but it is very much important to identify both urban and rural settings. The informal sector workforce is mostly affected, which is living around the main cities and also suburban cities of the rural areas. And the casual labor, the agricultural labor, and all these sectors are being affected. So there should be a very good mapping exercise in order to identify who are mostly affected under this situation of COVID. We have to identify also the production sectors, the market system, and what is the gap in the social protection system. I think in most countries, including Kenya, there is a very good social protection activities and programs. There is also a very good market system for crop production, for livestock market, and also open market system. How they are functioning, the open market system, the health aspect, are they really functioning well this time? Because of the lockdown, because of the restriction of movement, is the food supply going across the countries? If the market system is functioning? We have to understand it very well. Another most important part that the data collection or the information collection as a risk factor monitoring should consider is there a deterioration of the household food security and nutrition? Is there a decline in food consumption? Is there any adoption of a negative coping strategy? Are people reducing food? Are they going selling their household assets, productive assets? Is it eroding their future livelihood? Is there a change of livelihood activities in the future? Because whatever strategies people are following during this time will affect also the future of their livelihoods, not only the current situation. So we have to have a very consolidated and organized monitoring of the risk factors in order to identify the needs so that the response will be evidence-based. Another most important aspect that the risk factors monitoring is the markets are crucially playing a big role in this world, in this connected world. Both sectors, urban, rural settings, both the livestock and also the crop production, both the industries and other sectors are being connected by market. We have to have, are the markets are functioning in the right direction? Is access to market for all stakeholders, for the buyers and sellers, is it really functioning and working well? So we have to have a good system in order to monitor and identify areas that needs an intervention from the government and other stakeholders. What about the transportation system vis-a-vis the restriction of movement and all the lockdowns and the curfews? Does it function? Are we getting really a good policy direction from the governments and other stakeholders in order to have an affirmative action? Our commodities are flowing from the producer to the buyers. So these areas must be looked at. These are the key risk factors I would like to propose. When we discuss more, it can be enriched by other discussants. But these are the key areas that we have to identify in order to make decision on anticipatory action and also immediate, medium and long-term responses. Next slide, please. Valerie. Back, one slide back, please. Yes. Based on the risk, based on the monitored risk factors and based on identified needs, there should be an intervention from all stakeholders, as the government has already, taken in the country. So the employment opportunities, the employment opportunity to informal sector casual laborers to compensate income losses is really very crucial. we have to have, supporting the most vulnerable population, as we have identified the most vulnerable via safety net, social protection programs, and we have to complement also the food distribution in areas where it is important and essential. Availability of agricultural inputs are very crucial and important. We have to take, a very appropriate action now. Advocacy, especially advocacy groups should do for corridors to remain open and to overcome shortage of agricultural inputs to the local market and to the livestock sector and the agricultural food system, and to have a healthy supply chains across all production systems. The usual practice that we have running the kitchen gardens both urban and rural is also one of the recommended action during this time in order to have the food supply for high risk families. As we said, the stimulus package, safety net programs, not only for the crop production sector, we should not forget also the livestock sector, which is very crucial, which might be the restriction might affect the pastoral communities at large, and also their market systems. Another crucial thing that in the response, the hard hit farmers and rural communities due to desert locust infestation and crisis should be given due consideration. One important point which should not be forgotten: most schools and children were receiving school meals, and because of the closure of the schools, I think most children might nutrition situation might be affected. So we have to maintain the school feed program and also look at alternative meal arrangements which can compensate this for the vulnerable children. I think my time has gone out, so I have to stop at this point. I'll leave the floor for the discussant, and thank you very much. Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bello, for that substantive presentation, starting us off on the situation of food security in the world, in the region, and focusing then to the Kenyan situation, and telling us that it's important that we have a holistic approach to the food security situation, because it's not just a situation that has been created by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is a situation that is multifaceted and that needs a collaborative response and collaborative ideas from different practitioners and different sectors of society. So you have told us it's important for us to look at food security substantively, not only in relation to consumption, but we have to look at production, we have to look at the markets, and we have to look at enabling people to have for them to be able to access food, afford food. Please, if you're joining us, please just mute your microphone so that you are able to communicate. If you're joining the webinar, please mute your microphone so that you are able to communicate and so that we are able to follow the presentations without interruptions. So please mute your microphone so that you are able to focus on the presentations. So our next presenter is Professor Jane Ambuko from the University of Nairobi, talking to us about an important aspect of food security, which talks to the needs to make food available, to make food affordable and accessible. And this is the need to prevent post-harvest food losses and waste, and to ensure that each and every person is therefore able to access food. So please, Jen, if you hear me, please continue.
Hello, me, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please continue.
All right. Unfortunately, my video is on, so you can only hear me. Yeah, so thank you, Bello, for setting the pace with the broader perspective, the introduction, and the risk factors. I'm going to focus myself to the post-harvest component, where I look at the production. Val, please get to the next slide, please. So the outline, I'll look at the food security in the context of post-harvest loss reduction. We look at the extent and the impact from a global perspective.
Jen, can you hear me?
Yes.
There's an echo from your side. If you, I don't know, there's an echo from your side, so you are not very clear. Can you see if there's any challenge with your microphone, please?
Okay, so let me. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you better now. Please proceed.
Okay, so I had said that I would, the outline, I'll look at just 4 aspects of food security in the context of food loss in West. So from that slide, you can see the parts I'll cover. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So already Bello has highlighted the aspect of food security. And as you can see, we have those 4 aspects of food security, which will, all the 4 dimensions of food security have been affected or aggravated by this pandemic. So I'll not dwell on that because Bello has already dwelled on that. Next slide, please. So all those 4 aspects of food security will be affected during this pandemic. And already again, Bello highlighted the fact that despite food access to food being a fundamental right, there are many food insecure people globally and especially in Africa. 1 in 4 people are actually undernourished, and this is this situation.
Recording is on.
Hello. So this situation will be aggravated by the COVID pandemic. So if you can see in the background slide that there.
Hello, Jane. Are you there? Hello? Hello, Jane. Are you there? I'm sorry, participants. Technology can be quite challenging, especially in our third world countries in relation to access to electricity, internet connectivity, and challenges like that. So I think we have lost Jane for now. In order for us to be able to continue, I'll give the opportunity for Cisse to be able to make his presentation, and then we'll have the Jane's presentation subsequent to Cisse's presentation. Cisse, are you there?
Yes, Nicholas. Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Yeah, I'll just follow on to the previous presentation straight on. I think Bello has done a fantastic job in creating the connection between COVID and food security from the perspective of the 4 pillars of food security, and how the restrictions under COVID can affect the food security of different groups of people, and the measures that can be taken to offset the impact of COVID on food security, in addition to, of course, other related crises. What I will do in my presentation is basically to bring in the legal perspective to the issues. What is the role of law in this context? Just as a background, at the risk of self-promotion, I work for the Development Law Branch of the legal office at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which basically provides technical legal support to countries in the process of lawmaking in areas related to food and agriculture. It also includes capacity development in these connections. So what I will do in my presentation is basically to answer, next slide please, 3 basic questions which have already been raised in the previous presentation. In terms of justifying the topic, which is already done, I think by way of showing the relationship and problems. Whoever is just joining in, would you please mute your mic? I propose that either Nicholas or Valerie, as hosts from the University of Nairobi side, you can mute the mics of other people other than the speaker, I think. Yeah, I mean, just if you can. So I think that the rationale and the justification of the discussion has already been provided, that COVID poses serious food security threat from all aspects of food security. I'll be talking about what legal measures can be taken in the context of trying to minimize the effect of COVID on food security, of course, among legal measures, among a mix of other measures that have to be taken. And in taking that legal measure, what safeguards should be put in place to minimize the effect of the restrictions that may be brought about, 1, by the pandemic, 2, by the legal measures that may be taken in that context. So I'll try to address these 3 interrelated questions in the next couple of minutes that I'm left with. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Okay, let me proceed then until Jane catches up with me. Why do we need legislative measures under emergency in general and on COVID in particular? As you all know, pandemics like COVID pose exceptional danger that require some special measures or exceptional measures. Normal legal procedures may not be fit for purpose under such circumstances. Normal lawmaking and legislative processes may be time-taking and may not be fit to respond to the ever-changing, the fast-changing circumstances that countries may be faced with. So you will be left with this conundrum of balancing extraordinary legal measures that need to be taken and at the same time putting in place safeguards that would not make these extraordinary legal measures affect fundamental rights or be able to be fit for the purpose of addressing the problems of food security that may result from or be impaired by the COVID pandemic or other pandemics as well. There are existing international standards from international law to national legal measures that are taken under these circumstances. The role of law in this context is basically to define an institutional mandate, who does what under the circumstances, to ensure transparency on how things are done, what measures are taken in what ways, and hence avoid uncertainties for different stakeholders and affected population, but also to mitigate disruptions that in the food supply chain or food value chain that may result from restrictions required by the pandemic. Because law usually provides for sanctions and mechanisms of redress, it can also promote accountability. So we can say these are some of the main reasons why we would need a law. I see that Valerie had stopped sharing the screen. I can't see it, at least on the screen, the presentation, but I will continue from my own. Nicholas, am I correct? Do you see the presentation? I only see you now.
Just continue the presentation. I'm looking at what the challenge with Valerie is.
Okay. So what kind of legislative measures can be taken under circumstances like COVID-19. From our assessment, from the FAO legal side, legal office side, we see at least 2 or 3 categories of legislative measures that may be taken to respond to emergencies like COVID-19. One of them is called state of emergency. This is the kind of power that is given to government to declare a state of emergency that allows government to get power that it doesn't normally have, including rule making without the approval of the continuous approval of Parliament, for example, although Parliament often takes part in the declaration of state of emergency. So that means the government would be able to pass detailed rules, including on food marketing, for example, in relation to COVID, stay-at-home issues, restriction on freedom of movement, which is a fundamental right. And this may somehow also affect the distribution of food and related matters. And internationally accepted standards in relation to state of emergency provide that there are non-derogable rights, like the right against torture, right to life, and related types of rights. There could be an argument that any state of emergency declaration and rules adopted thereunder should not go to the extent of affecting subsistence measures, for example, measures that would impede people from accessing food, especially those who are in a particularly vulnerable situation, as highlighted by Baloo. The second category of laws you find are those laws that relate to disaster preparedness and response. In different countries, in modern days, they're called disaster risk management laws, disaster risk reduction laws. What they do is basically they put in place mechanisms of disaster preparedness and response, including how international assistance may be requested, and they try to address vulnerabilities and establish or support long-term resilience of populations, institutions, and so on and so forth. But also they provide for early warning early warning mechanisms that would put in place a mechanism of knowing security threats or other threats that may result. Okay, now we're back on the presentation, which is good. I'm on the second, or the one in the middle category. Such laws also provide for intersectoral coordination mechanisms and accountability of agencies and personnel at different levels. The third category is what we call food security and nutrition legislation in general. They may come in under different names. They may just be food security laws, Food Act, in different countries, nutrition legislation, right to food legislation. If they are broad enough, or there might be some specific food security legislation addressing particular issues like food reserves, or strategic food reserves may be part of broader legislation, whereby countries provide for institutional responsibility, budget, and related issues for food reserve. They may also provide for food security information system, including early warning mechanisms. When food security threats are in the horizons, there should be a mechanism to alert the different institutional mechanisms of responding and preparing for that eventuality, but also social protection systems or special measures for vulnerable groups may be provided by such legislation. Next slide, please. Under COVID, what happens is if you have a state of emergency declaration, and you restrict as a result freedom of movement or right to movement, which is required by the nature of the pandemic, this may have direct impact on food distribution, distribution of agricultural inputs, the production of food and the distribution of food, but also the movement of agricultural workers, people who work for the day to to win the day, basically, to get their daily meal. Those may be affected. That's where the problem may be. In relation to disaster risk management laws, the question could be about their suitability for health-related pandemic. For example, often from my review of some laws of different countries, related laws, they talk about, they're fit for the purpose of natural disasters, right? Earthquake, maybe including flooding and so on and so forth. But they also look into long-term resilience issues and vulnerabilities. And when a pandemic like this hits a country or the whole world just like that in a couple of months, the fitness of such laws for such kind of problems have to be inquired into. Food security and nutrition-related legislation and other sectoral legislation, including those that provide agricultural insurance and protection to farmers, and so on and so forth. Many of them may not include robust provisions on food security information system, including early warning. Even when they have such provisions, institutional capacity and resource availability to mobilize what is required to respond to such problems like COVID-19 could be quite challenging. When we look at the legal measures or framework that are in place in Kenya along these three perspectives that I have adopted in the earlier slides, what we find is there is this interesting COVID-19 Response and Management Act, which is put in place to safeguard and protect the rights of citizens in relation to public health, medical services, extend social protection, and also economic functions which relate to somehow food marketing, distribution, and so on and so forth. The social protection aspect is very good depending on how it's implemented to respond to vulnerabilities, the most vulnerable, the social safety net related issues that have been highlighted by Balu earlier. It's not clear if this can be, if this can qualify as a state of emergency declaration, but it looks like that's not the way it is adopted. But the main thing is there is this initiative, or at least an act, which is meant to respond to the situation. The gaps we see is in the other two situations, which ensure long-term preparedness to problems like this and ease of responding to the problem without the need to go adopting and putting in place a new legal framework with new institutional and funding requirements. Disaster risk management policy is in place, but a law that has been drafted from 2019 has not been adopted. So as a result, the government has been relying on Public Health Act, which participants from Kenya can tell us if these are fit for the purpose of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic with all its peculiarities. There is a food security bill from 2017 with some very good information provisions on food insecurity and information mapping. This mapping exercise, which is a synchronon to identifying where the problems are and who needs assistance and so on and so forth, as Balu has addressed, is not. But the problem is this law has not been adopted, and as a result, we cannot be sure if the necessary institutional mechanisms are in place, which could have been mobilized in response to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So that is about the Kenya situation. But in general, what legal considerations can be, what legal safeguards or measures can be put in place to mitigate the risk of food insecurity? The legal office of FAO recently published a policy brief entitled Legal Considerations that may help under COVID-19 that may help mitigate the risks of food insecurity. There is, in the next slide, Valerie, if you may go 2 slides down, I have shared the link, which we can share after this webinar as well. It highlights a number of issues that should be taken into account in putting in place legal measures, again, with a view to reduce the risks of food insecurity under COVID. If a state of emergency is declared, for example, there should be a safeguard that avoids limitation of movement of food products as well as agricultural and subsistence workers. It's easy to declare to require stay at home in developed countries, but in countries like ours, where millions of people earn their living by daily labor, it would be a very difficult kind of prescription. And a balance has to be created between the measures of stay at home and the requirements of sustenance and subsistence for millions of people. That's one. It should be on the next slide, Valerie, please. I'm sorry, this is taking a little bit of time, but I'm wrapping up, moderator. The other point that has been highlighted already by Balu as well is to protect the most vulnerable by protecting basic income, making sure that employees are not fired from their jobs during the pandemic, for example, but also expanding social protection and social security schemes for low-income households, women with children, especially the elderly, people with disabilities, homeless people, and so on and so forth. So laws should basically require this. Effective coordination across agricultural and food sectors is very essential because, for example, this is a health pandemic which the ministry in charge of health alone cannot respond to. You can imagine the impact of on food security would require coordination with ministries in charge of finance, agriculture, and other agencies as well. Mobilization of funds, in some countries, food banks, distribution centers may be prescribed by rules adopted under the pandemic or already pre-existing legislation if they are well defined. Market information, inspection, control, and surveillance of food businesses by competent authorities. Price control is one essential element in the mix, for example, because under these circumstances, there could be hoarding, price inflation by some food businesses. Supporting and incentivizing local food production and sale, agricultural credit, giving relief for small farmers who have credits, for example, under this situation, reducing food loss and waste. All these issues should be taken into account and prescribed by laws that are defined for the long term, as well as laws adopted under the COVID pandemic situation. I don't see the last slide, but with this, I bring my presentation to an end, but I would be very happy to answer any related question you may have. Thank you, and over to you, moderator.
Hello?
Nicholas, can you hear me? I see Jen is talking now. Over to you, Nicholas or Jen.
Can't hear.
Yes, I'm here. I'm waiting for Val to put the slides on. Hello?
Jen, I think you should just go ahead from your slides because time is running. You can just go ahead from your own slides that you have on your computer.
Hello, Jen, just proceed from your slides.
Okay, so Valerie is not on. Okay,
Hello?
so I had already indicated that, okay, no problem. So I had already indicated that given the background that has been given on the, yes, I'm speaking. Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello?
Proceed, please. Proceed.
Yes. So I had indicated that my presentation, I'll look at the post-harvest component of this problem, how food loss and waste is going to be either aggravated or it will contribute to the food insecurity challenge. I can see the slides are on. So next slide, please. Next to the third slide, Val, please. The third slide. Okay. So the third slide, as she loads it, I had the previous presenters have brought out the issues or the four components or the 4 dimensions of food security, which is food availability, food access, and then the aspect of stability and utilization, which you can see on that slide, the previous slide that Val has just removed. So all these 4 dimensions of food security will be affected by during this pandemic. And this slide, again, the slide that is showing, again, was highlighted by Belu in the first presenter, where he said that 1 in 4 people, they suffer from some form of food insecurity. Next slide, please. And so there are various levels of food insecurity, as you'll see in the that there is mild food insecurity, there's moderate food insecurity to severe food insecurity. Please continue to the next slide, Val, please. So people who are food insecure, people in Africa, in Kenya, are food insecure, will worsen under this pandemic. Even those who feel that they are insecure as food secure, again, they will be affected because of issues from my screen. So the slide that should be displaying is the slide that shows the levels of food insecurity. Val, please move to the next slide. The next slide, please. Hello? Hello?
Please continue.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, go back to the previous slide, because there's something I was highlighting there. I think you've moved. Go back and back to the slide number 5.
Hello,
The slide
please.
number 5.
If you're joining us,
Yes, this
please,
one.
can
Okay.
you mute your
Okay, so this
microphones
slide,
when you're joining
on this
us,
slide,
please. Samuel, please
so on
mute your.
All right. Can I continue?
Yes, continue, please.
So on this slide, you can see there are various levels of food insecurity. So for people who are already food insecure, the pandemic will worsen the situation. Especially for those who we say they live from hand to mouth, they have to work daily to gain their economic access to food. And these are the people you can see on that slide. We're saying that there are people who say that I would rather die from COVID infection than starve to death. But even then, those who may consider themselves to be food secure, which is on the lower part of the scale, they may actually also be challenged if the situation worsens. And for example, we are all not allowed to move out of our houses. So you may have economic access to food. You might be able to, you have money to buy food, but you can't move to buy food. So if the situation worsens, we'll all be affected in some way by this COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So you can see in the next slide now, which brings me to the topic of food waste and loss. So what is ironic is that despite the reality that there are many people many among us were going to bed hungry every day. Food is actually being lost in our food supply chains. And as you can see on that slide, 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted. This is according to FAO reports. We still don't have reliable data. So that is the irony of things, that food is being wasted or lost in the supply chain while there are people who are going to bed hungry. Next slide, please. So next slide, Val, please. So what does this mean? So this food that is being wasted can actually feed the hungry, all right? So you can see these are just global statistics that from FAO and other organizations, that food that is being wasted can actually feed 1.6 billion people globally, the global food waste. And if just one in four quantities of the food that is being wasted sufficient to feed the people that are currently undernourished. Again, food loss and waste just simply means there's lost income. The lost income is for many practitioners in the food chain, but especially to the smallholder farmers who are actually currently really suffering from this situation. And then, of course, ultimately, there's a big impact on environment. We are talking about a contribution to greenhouse gases and when you talk about food waste, you can see sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably. Val, the next slide, please. Food loss, we're talking about food, decrease in food quantity and food quality, so that the food doesn't make it, these losses make the food and this occurs for the supply chain from harvest through to processing and distribution. Then food waste is when we talk about food that is of good quality and fit for human consumption, but does not get consumed. It's discarded before it gets spoiled. So that is depicted in that value chain that you're seeing down there. So just so that we have an understanding, when we talk about food waste and food loss, we are on a common understanding. Next slide. So in this next slide, we see, I initially said that 1.3 billion tons of food is lost. But in this slide, you can see the distribution of these losses in the various value chains. And of particular interest is you can see if 100% is 1.3 billion tons, 44% of those losses come from fruits and vegetables. And then plus, of course, 20% coming from roots and tubers. So that means, and if you know Kenya and the horticulture sector and its importance to smallholder farmers in the rural areas, the people who are being affected are these smallholder farmers. So when we lose 44%, we are losing not just food, but also losing income as indicated for these smallholder farmers. So next slide, please, Val. So how are these, if you look at the losses, how are these, if you pick the distribution of these losses globally, from a global scale, we see that the distribution in the different parts of the world. So I focus on Africa, which is the one highlighted with red. That is how the losses are distributed. Let's go to the next slide. So the losses, if we unpack that part for Africa, the losses are distributed across the supply chain, as you can see, like that. And of course, we say, according to the global statistics that we call the FAO statistics, we say that the losses will happen. Most of the losses happen at the harvest and the harvest and post-harvest stage. But you see in this graph that the losses at consumption are very small. But this is gonna change. It's changing big time, as we shall see in the subsequent slides. So you see, food loss at all stages will actually be aggravated by different factors at the different stages as I try to unpack this in the subsequent slide. Next slide, please, Val. So you can see in the next slide, and you have probably been seeing this on TV, where people are saying, you know what, there's food at the farm level. People, because of labor, the impact of COVID on labor force, the people who work on this farm, some of the food is not being harvested. And then we have food that is harvested but is there in the field is not being collected. I know the government has tried to ensure that food is moving, but what the system, the informal systems that are involved in food movement have been affected. So we're talking about people who put maybe a crate of 2 or a sack of produce in a matatu coming from the rural areas where this production is happening. If that system has been disrupted, it means that these people, there's a formal system, but the informal system that has been affected is actually affecting movement of food from the farms to the urban areas, or even just within those rural farms. So the disruption in the informal system for me and the market change. So some of these people, they're actually supplying food. They have contracts to supply food to institutions, to restaurants that are now closed. So this food is there, but it's not, even if you want to move, yet where you're moving it is not that system. I mean, your end target is not working. The restaurants and the institutions that take this food have been closed. So this food is there. What do these people do with this food? So there's a lot of wastage at the farm now, that because food is not moving as it should. Okay, especially for the informal system. I know there are formal systems that are working, but the informal system where your smallholder traders depend on, those systems have been significantly interrupted by the lockdown and the restricted movement. So the next slide, please. Then that is for the perishables. Okay, that is for the perishable commodities. These are where you're seeing a lot of losses and wastage. Those photos speak volume. Then we have the non-perishables. Again, these ones, the losses could be there. They are there. Okay, at the farm level, it's a question of storage. Okay, how are people, if you harvested your produce and then you can't get it to the market, how have you stored your produce? And this is not just for the farmers, it's also for the consumers. You have your grains or your flour, which you purchase maybe during the panic buy. You have it. How have you stored it? So if you don't store properly, the post-harvest pest, they're gonna destroy. You lose your produce, quantitative, but also how you've stored. If you've not stored your flour, your grains properly, you will suffer quality loss. We're talking about the impact of aflatoxins. So we have to be very careful what we have in store. Yes, we may have the food, but how we have preserved it or stored it might lead to quantitative and qualitative losses. And then what is happening at the market? Again, restricted movement of food at the market level will have, if even Mama Mboga has food, but if people are not, moving, coming to buy the food, if I usually do daily, move trips to the market to buy food, but now I probably do only once in a week. What does that mean to Mama Mboga if she does not have proper storage? That means wastage at that stage. All right. So, and then at the household level, some of us we did panic buy. We bought a lot of food because we feared that we'll be restricted to go to the market. So what is happening to the food that you bought? Okay, so first, how you stored, like I said already, and then unplanned cooking. Sometimes because we are now there, you're just cooking food. Maybe the food you're cooking, some of it goes to waste because you can't reuse it. So how you're using the food that you already have in terms of storage, in terms of cooking food that you eat and doesn't go to waste. And then there's an element of debts. Yeah, so let us go to the, please move. I think I moved on using my slides. I've moved. Val, please move. Yes. So move. Yes, this one. I think I've moved. Move this slide. I think I've already explained this slide. Then this one is the one I'm talking about. Panic buying, the food that you have, how you're using food at your household. So move to the next slide. The issue of debt levels. Many of us, one of the things that is obviously going to contribute to wastage at the household level is the confusion we have with it. So sometimes you have all these levels and you don't understand what it means. Okay, even I have to confess that I didn't understand what some of these labels mean until I got educated about them. So when you see the label on your food saying best before, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that food is bad. It's just that the quality may not be optimal, but it's still fit for consumption. So people need to understand these labels, because otherwise we're going to throw away a lot of food that is still good for consumption. Then I've highlighted something on the juice label that you're seeing, that is juice. There are some instructions on the juice or labels on your food that you need to understand. Like this particular one, it says, once opened, keep refrigerated and enjoy within 4 days. Do people understand what that means? Sometimes you will keep your juice, after you've opened, it's still maybe not refrigerated, but it's going to harm you. So people need to understand labels on the package, because this is not only can contribute to waste, because we'll throw food that is still fit for consumption, but also if you don't understand the labels, you're actually going to poison yourself by eating food that is not fit for consumption. So next slide, please. So those are factors, just in a nutshell, some of the factors that are going to contribute to food loss and waste at different stages. Now, this slide just shows we are committed to reduce losses. I will not unpack this, because at the global level, at the continental level, national level, we are committed to reduce, post-harvest losses, and there are a lot of efforts to realize this stuff. Okay, at all the levels. So I will not go into that, but just the next slide, some quick interventions. Okay, there are a lot of efforts, big interventions to reduce losses at many levels, but just quick interventions under this COVID level. Quick intervention. Next slide, please. Like I said, I've highlighted some of the common issues. So for me, one of the things that really we have to do something about is proper storage of all commodities at all levels. Okay, with the goal of preserving quality, extending the marketing period. So we're talking about in the grains and non-perishable, we're talking about the dry chain, that the food need to be dried. If they are grains, they need to be dried properly, they need to be stored properly. And we'll look at some of the options there. The cold chain for perishables, because if you harvest your produce and you can't get it to the market, it's going to waste at the field. Okay, so what are the options for cold chains for perishables in the field and even beyond the field when the food reaches the market? Okay, then there's for me, one of the things, and we try to work on this for perishables in fruits, that community aggregation centers that are equipped with appropriate facilities. For perishables, you're talking about cold storage. For non-perishables, community aggregation, we are talking about options for storage. Some of these, like hermetic storage, these technologies are there. Food banks. Okay, now this is something that is not common for us in Kenya, in Africa, but food banks or food donation centers in strategic locations, because people may have food, they may want to contribute. Maybe I bought excess food during panic buying, and now it is going to expire. I would like to donate. Where do I take this food? Consumer education. The element of what does it and how do you need to store your food, because it's just having food in your house and you've stored it under conditions that would actually contribute to spoilage will not help you. You will eat food that is unsafe. So storage at the household level, and then of course there are measures for waste reduction. So the next slide just highlight. Next slide, please, Van. The next slides just highlight some of the technologies, and these technologies are there. These technologies for hermetic storage technologies, they are applicable for household storage. They are applicable for community aggregation. These bags are there, they're in the market. How do we ensure that people, our farmers and producers or people that are involved in handling know about these technologies and they use them, because this will, at least hermetic storage, will help us to at least, very least, aggravate quantitative and qualitative. I mean, not aggravate, but alleviate quantitative and qualitative losses in grain. Next slide, please. So the next slide is just what we have been trying to do as University of Nairobi. Next slide. We try to, provide cold storage alternatives. Next slide, please, for smallholders. And this, we already have shown how you can actually bring farmers together, farmers in groups, and then if they have access to cold storage. Right now, those who are stuck with perishables, they don't know, because their system is disrupted. This produce can be aggregated in community centers, where then it is accessible to those who need those who need to buy the food, or say the traders, that they don't have to go looking for small quantities in the rural areas, but they can access this produce in one center. This will be available not only for the for the traders, but also if government, for example, wanted to ensure that, these, centers where they want to distribute food, they want to access fruits and veggies, they want to access, grains. Yes, if they are, aggregated, then they should be able to move with ease, because there's this now formal system to move food. But if you don't have, this food maybe in the village aggregated somewhere, then it is harder. But for me, my point is, if we can have this food, in centers, then it is easy to access the food. Next slide, please, the final slide. So this slide basically is the hierarchy, what we call the food. No, the previous slide, please. Previous one. The food loss hierarchy. Previous slide, please. Previous slide, please.
Jen?
Previous slide is the final slide. It's the previous slide. Let me just summarize, because this shows what we need to do. This is the hierarchy of, food loss reduction. We prevent, we distribute food that, if like I said, if we have a proper distribution center, food banks, food shelters, homes and all, distribution food. So we prevent the loss. We distribute food that would otherwise go to waste. And then that which is not fit for human consumption can be used as feed. And then there's composting and renewable energy options, and then disposal. Disposal is your last option. So the final slide there, basically, as a parting shot, I'm going to quote the Pope. Last slide, please. The last slide, please. Oh, the last slide, please. Yes. So basically, we need to reduce. So not just now, but food loss and waste need to be reduced through and through. And like the Pope says, we need to be reminded that food that is discarded is, in a certain sense, stolen from the table of the poor. So it is imperative that we do all we have to do to minimize or to reduce the food loss and waste, not just now, but continuously, so that we ensure that food is available, especially to those that really need the food. So that is the end of my presentation. And I hope that we can interact beyond this to see how we can do this, to put our efforts together to ensure that some of these propositions are effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for that substantive presentation on food loss. We'll look very, very briefly on financing because of time, and that financing will be presented by myself. So, Val, if you can go to my presentation, I will just be looking at all these challenges that have been noted by the presenters. How has the government tried to react to them in the context of financing these different interventions to enhance food security? And when we talk about financing, we'll be looking at financing in the context of revenue generation as well as expenditure, expenditure in the context of priority areas of intervention, both in the supply side as well as the demand side in relation to food security. So if you go to the next slide, please. Bellew has talked quite substantively about food security being a mammoth challenge to Kenya, and that the COVID-19 pandemic being just an aspect or an issue that has brought about or brought this challenge of food security to the forefront. But we have quite a substantive challenge in Kenya in meeting our food security because of different or diverse challenges. High level of poverty and high level of people who are just above the poverty line, 36.5% people in multi-dimensional poverty, 65% just hovering above the international poverty line. And with the COVID-19, approximately 23 million people in sub-Saharan Africa going to fall into poverty. And this poverty includes food poverty, so quite a substantive challenge for government. We have precarious informal employment, which is basically agricultural, non-agricultural, 8% of non-agricultural employment being in informal sector. And this the people in informal sector cannot be able to access physically the work that they have to do, and they cannot work from home, which means that they're losing work. The issue of climate change has been talked about by Bellew, and we know for a fact that food production is going to reduce by 13 to 25% according to the World Bank. And we have the challenge of locusts and other pests and diseases. So if you see in the context of Africa already before the COVID pandemic, 20% of the population being food poor. In the context of Kenya, according to Tegemeo Institute, we have 12 million people that are food poor, and according to projections by the World Food Programme, this is likely to double. So it's important, therefore, that we look at this this challenge that is going to increase in the near future. Valerie, the next slide. So how do you finance this challenge that the country has? I don't think there are any new forms of financing that you can think of. It's just the normal general financing that we have that has to be redirected towards meeting the challenge of food security. So if you look at the Kenyan context, for example, you have to look to government budgetary allocations to be able to meet this. And we already had a budget in 2019 of 2019-2020 that is about 3.2 trillion. And we have allocations to departments or areas of focus that have impact on food security. We have health, we have social protection, and we have agriculture. And if you look at allocations already there, we already have a challenge in that the amount of money that was put to be able to meet the challenges of health, the challenges of social protection, and the challenges of agriculture is not sufficient. If you look at health, we have budgets being only 5% of the budgets going to health, when Kenya has already signed into the Abuja Declaration that requires the government to have 15% of the budget funding healthcare. So that means we have to look for money from other aspects of the budget to be able to fund the current challenge for health as well as food security. In the context of social protection, we only have 4% of the budget. In the context of agriculture, we only have 3% of the budget, when the Malabo Declaration requires African states to have 10% of their budgets to be able to meet the challenge of food security and agricultural production. And the challenge is that most of this is going to recurrent expenditures, paying staff and things like that. So the money that can actually be used to ensure food security for the majority of the population that is currently vulnerable to food insecurity is quite limited. So in order to deal with the food security situation, the Kenyan government has put in place the contingency plan to deal with COVID and allocated or reallocated budgets to be able to meet this particular challenge in relation to taking money from other areas of focus to the issue of responding to COVID and creating the COVID-19 fund. The government has also put in place fiscal measures to increase disposable income and lower prices of basic commodities to enhance access to food and to ensure food security by basically tax or fiscal measures such as reduction of payee, reduction of corporate tax, reduction of VAT, and reduction of turnover tax, as well as reducing the money that is used to transfer mobile money from one person to the other. The government has also put in place monetary policies by the central bank to be able to encourage banks to have liquidity to continue lending and to also offer flexibility to distressed borrowers, be they individuals or businesses. And this is important because it then enhances the ability of people to access credit at this particular time and be able to either pay staff or continue with business, even in the context of an economy that is slowing down because of the measures that have been put in place to manage or to contain the spread of COVID. We also have legal protection that has been put in place by the government in order to ensure that people who are employed do not lose their jobs. and also to ensure that if they don't lose their jobs, then they have income that can be used for food and nutrition security. We have a parliamentary proposal for concessionary loan to be able to support 4 million vulnerable households in urban and peri-urban areas, and also to support affected businesses in terms of payroll support and concessional credits to business, small and medium enterprises. And this is important. But the challenge that we have is that we have a government that is already quite constrained in terms of its fiscal capacities in relation to deficits, current account deficits, and forex reserves and public debt. So it has very little room to maneuver. And so it becomes difficult for such a government to be able to raise the necessary resources, not only to respond to the health challenges that are raised by COVID, but also to ensure that people who are facing food insecurity as a result of the pandemic, as well as a result of the measures that have been put in place to address the pandemic, actually get the necessary support that they have. Also, the challenge in relation to containment measures that will limit or that have limited economic activity. And this will have both the short-term and long-term impact on food security. Short-term impact in that people are losing jobs, losing income, and not being able to provide for their families from the resources that they are used to getting to support through jobs and through business. And also because of low demand for export disruption of other areas of foreign earnings like tourism, foreign direct investments and remittances. And what this is going to do in the long run is that it's going to reduce both the taxes that the government can generate, as well as the other forms of finances that people have, even through remittances, to be able to meet their household food needs. The other challenge in relation to governmental budgetary allocations is the issue of transparency, accountability, and value for money. If you've looked at the standard today, the $50 billion US that was given by the World Bank and how it has been spent, leaves a lot to be desired in relation to governmental transparency and accountability. And this will affect the resources that therefore are available to meet the food needs of those who are facing challenge as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Valerie, yes. To supplement governmental resources, we have development and humanitarian assistance, and this has come through for the government. If you look at the support that the government has received from the international financial institutions, or that will receive from the international financial institutions, to be able to provide or to create a framework for the provision of food through cash transfers or through food distribution to different people that will need. And even the finances that has been directed expressly to health will help, because it will free up resources that the government has in other, either through the budget or other areas, to be able to provide for food security. So we have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, having made some provisions for Kenya in relation to budgetary support, in relation to health support, or to cushion the economy. And what will be important here is how that money is used in order to ensure that the different aspects of food security are actually taken into account as one of the important areas of intervention in the use of this development assistance money. Then we also have humanitarian assistance as an important component of financing in relation to food security. We already have several international international non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, national government, non-governmental organizations, and faith-based organizations working in the area of food security. And their programming is important to support or to continue cushioning the households that have been supported by those programs through food distribution and cash transfers. We also have flash appeals that have been put out by the international community through the UN. UN has made an appeal of 267.5 million. WFP has made a flash appeal, and that money would be important to be able to enable those international actors to also continue providing for the programs that they have for food security, but also the programs that can be created, new programs that can be created to ensure that the majority of the people are actually able to access some form of food. Of course, there are challenges in relation to reliance on development and humanitarian assistance because donor countries are also facing a challenge. So there are those inward-looking policies that will make it that very little money is available to give as aid. Also, each and every country in the world is experiencing this COVID challenge. So that means that even the money that is available will be too little to send to the different states that are facing a challenge. Development assistance always comes with conditionalities that limits government policy space to prioritize, and this can affect food security because you see more and more of the support that is given is directed to health, and very little is directed substantially to food security. Also, issue of transparency and accountability. We have already seen that with the World Bank money that was given to Kenya. And if that challenge continues, then those who are in most need, the most food insecure, will not be able to find support, both through development assistance as well as the governmental resources that are available. We also have challenge in relation to transparency and accountability for humanitarian agencies. Will these flash appeals be used to support the most vulnerable, or can they be redirected to other unintended purposes? And so the issue of accountability is also important in that aspect. The next slide, Valerie. So to supplement governmental and humanitarian assistance, we have the private sector, and Kenya has been very good. Kenyans have been very good with people-to-people support. And through corporate donations, the Kenyan government has been able to receive 1 billion to the COVID-19 fund, as well as corporate solidarity drive to ensure that there is sufficient money to give to poor people, households in the urban centers. We have the Chikhalia Emergency Cash Transfer Program that is seeking to raise about 200 million to support 2 million urban families by sending them $30 per month for 3 months during this duration of the COVID. And if you look at, if this comes through, this people-to-people cash transfer comes through, it will support more of the most vulnerable people than would have been possible if it wasn't there. But equally, this also has challenges in relation to the slowdown of economic activities, and therefore it's not possible for corporates and individuals to contribute as much as they would want to support such measures. There have been private people-to-people drive to collect and distribute food, as well as to distribute other non-food items that are needed or required by the population. And also there's the drive to have civil servants and other individuals take salary cuts to be able to free up money to be able to support the COVID-19 responses, which would include food security. The challenge to this is that already civil servants are not as well paid, especially the lower cadre of civil servants, and their food security is also threatened if aspects of their money is taken away to be able to support others. So this is a voluntary process. So people would be protected in that they don't have to give their salaries that enhances theirs and their families' food security in order to support a government, especially because of challenges of accountability for the funds that are being used by the government. Next slide, please. So what areas of expenditure should be prioritized to enhance food security? it has been said by the previous presenters that the 4 elements of food security have to be looked at: production, distribution, to enhance availability, access, utilization, and stability of the food system. So we already know that lockdown measures is making it hard for people to be able to farm. And it's important, therefore, that the government enhances or ensures that as an agriculture being an essential service, people should be allowed to go to their farms, produce not only for the medium term, but also to enhance the long-term food security. There's also need to subsidize provisions like seeds, fertilizer, pesticides in order for farmers, especially smallholder farmers, to continue food production to enhance food security in the future. There's need to invest in technology to ensure agricultural extension and advisory services continue, even when they're respecting the social distancing rules that have been put in place. And it's also important to increase funding and technology to deal with pests and diseases, especially the locust. In relation to distribution, it's important that the government opens up the farmer or produce markets to ensure that farmers' produce gets to markets and that the poor households then are able to access fresh and affordable foods. So in relation to opening of markets, in order to prevent contagion, it's important that there is investment to improve infrastructure in these farmer markets, improve sanitation and hygiene, and ensure that they operate in a way that respects the virus containment measures. It's also important to invest in knowledge sharing and sensitization to reduce chances of contagion, and this has been done already by the government through providing for the measures that have to be put in place in restaurants for people to be able to access or to still be able to get food in the restaurants. It has not been put in place in relation to farmer markets, and it's important that farmer markets are opened in order for for the farmers, for the traders, the transporters, and the households that depend on those farmer markets to be able to realize their food security. It's important that through distribution, the government puts in place measures to supplement those areas of food importation to ensure that our reserves are full and to ensure that food remains available and the food market remains stable in the near term and in the long term. The next slide. In relation to the supply chain, the challenges in relation to supply chain is the loss of income by the majority. So there's need for cash transfers to be able to cushion poor households or households that are falling into poverty. There are already governmental efforts to provide support to the vulnerable, like elderly, persons with disability, orphans, and vulnerable children. But this needs to be scaled up to all those people who are falling into poverty as a result of the measures that have been put in place to contain the COVID virus spread. There's also need for more distribution of food, if possible, obeying the social distancing rules in urban and peri-urban areas. This has been done in Rwanda and Uganda, and it has also been attempted in Mombasa and in other places. And it's important that this happens so that people are able to access food. There's need for increased nutrition support to expectant women, lactating mothers, and children under 5, because if they miss that particular important support at this particular time, then the long-term effects to health, development, and productivity will be quite substantive. So it's important that there's a focus to nutrition for lactating mothers and children. Humanitarian assistance and support to refugees and IDPs. This has already been undertaken substantively by the humanitarian organizations like WFP and UNHCR, but there's need for more support, especially because of the lack of support structures to IDPs and refugees in the places where they're staying. There's also need for governmental injection into the economy through economic stimuli packages to cushion small and medium enterprises and to enhance job retention, to ensure that incomes are saved, domestic remittances are possible, to ensure that households are able to meet their food security. The Kenyan government has tried the finances.
Nicholas, I'm sorry, would you please wrap up? We're running out of time, I'm sorry.
That's the last slide, please.
Okay.
So those are the challenges, financial challenges that the government has. Those are the challenges that they have been able to respond to using the different mechanisms, financial mechanisms that have indicated. And so I will end there and open the floor to the next speaker, our discussant, who will be Mary. Please, Mary, your intervention in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Nicholas. Mine will be a very quick summary simply because we're running out of time. I think I'd just like to contextualize the issue in terms of what is happening on the ground in Kenya. So we have the issue of lockdowns being imposed and social distancing rules being implemented, which have caused issues along the supply chain. For instance, transportation of goods has been difficult, and this has caused wastage at the post-production after harvesting. On top of that, this has also caused issues when it comes to the closure of markets. So markets are being closed, and that makes it difficult for people in rural areas and in the urban areas as well, the urban poor, people who are generally accustomed to shopping from markets, having difficulty to find access to food. Not everybody shops in supermarkets, despite the fact that supermarkets are the ones that continue to run. So this has been particularly difficult. Now, this also needs to be taken in the context, as Belly who said, of the fact that we have difficulties that are being faced that are multiple. So we had the floods, the rains, the long rains last year that caused damage to food, and then that coupled together with COVID-19 and together with the locust invasion that has damaged food as well, that also creates food insecurity. In addition to that, we also have farmers who are facing uncertainty in these times. So despite the fact that we have the current issues that are being faced, we have future ones that we can anticipate. So farmers facing insecurity in terms of, who will buy my food, how will I get my food to the market, are facing difficulties with raising finance raising finances to grow the crop for the next season. And at the same time, they're facing difficulties in terms of if we cannot, first, we don't have finances to grow crop for the next season, and second, we're unsure if anybody will buy. So that will create a problem down the line. Now, in addition, compounding all those issues together, we have domestic constraints to providing enough food. And largely because we are importers of food, we also have international problems. So for instance, we have the challenge with getting food quickly to the country when it comes to imports, because one, there's not enough data, or rather the data is produced rather late in terms of how much is in the reserves. And then secondly, we have restrictions in terms of how fast it is to process the importation of food coming in. I think I'll leave it at that and pass on to the next speaker.
John.
Thank you. We, as Kenya, we are alive to the fact that even before the COVID pandemic, we had issues with food security in the country. And just looking back to the experiences that we had last year, we recall that at the beginning of the year, we had a poor season. The March to May 2019 season performed poorly. Later in the year, that is the short rains came, they were good, but we had floods in the country, which led to close to 300 deaths and a lot of displacement and loss of livelihoods. At the same time, we had problems with pests like the fall armyworm, issues of food prices, and towards the end of the year, the desert locust invasion. That means even at the start of the year when COVID now became an issue, we had more than 1 million, actually 1.3 million people were assessed to be food insecure, and that was mainly in the areas that are categorized as arid and semi-arid regions in the country. So in that regard, we see a situation where our food security situation was already in poor shape. And with the coming of COVID, now we have these numbers going to beyond 5 million because of the inclusion of the urban population. Currently, the issue, as the panelist and my colleague has indicated, we have seen the major constraints with regard to food distribution, the issue of ensuring that markets remain operational, both at the supply side and also from the consumption end, and the need to take care of people's livelihoods, be they the urban poor, the rural farmhands, and also ensuring that inputs for farmers are available to support food production is key. One last point is the importance of us as a country keeping an eye on the other hazards. This includes the issue of floods that we have experienced in the current month. We have seen deaths in West Pokot. It has been reported that more than 100 people have died in April from the floods incidences in the country, which has affected more than 20 counties and also displaced more than 100,000 households. The issue of the desert locust invasion is still with us, and it is important for government and other development partners to balance resources in which would be used to respond to COVID and also these other hazards, the ones arising from floods, locust invasion. A lot of post-harvest losses have been experienced, and therefore looking at the complexity of our situation at the country in terms of the multiple hazards is key. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. We have several questions that have been asked through chat. I'll direct them to the presenters. The first question is from Joanne and is to Cisse, and the question is, even though law has ensured that there's limitation of mobility and the need that mobility is enhanced to ensure that the food supply chains work, how can the law mitigate between the need for reduction in mobility vis-a-vis the need for movement of food supplies to ensure that the food supply chains work effectively? A question from Erickson Kiare to Professor Jane and Bellew. Since there are several
Excuse me, Nicholas, may I propose something? We're left with barely 10 minutes. We have all read the questions in the chat box. Can we just address the questions addressed to us very briefly, each of us, rather than you reading all the questions to us, if you agree?
I have very few questions.
I can start if you want.
Okay.
I can start if you want, because I have noted all the legal questions.
Okay, please continue.
And others may do the same as we go, because I don't want to keep participants for much longer than we promised. Yeah, thank you. I have noted basically three questions. Joan and Niano both asked about accountability in managing the pandemic and related funds. Remember, in my presentation, I highlighted two broad categories of legislative measures. One is the more urgent, let's say, kind of ad hoc legal measure, which is state of emergency declaration. The other is more long-term commitment that put in place mechanisms of responding to emergency situations, the disaster risk reduction related laws, and also emergency provisions in food security and other sectoral legislation. In both cases, the hallmark of a legislative response is to put in place accountability mechanisms, internally inbuilt accountability mechanisms within the specific legislation, including state of emergency declaration, but also external accountability mechanisms that give power to courts and other institutions to make sure that things go by the law. The second question from Joan is like a very critical question. How do we balance restrictions of mobility with mobility requirements of food supply chain? I think this is one of the most critical questions of the restrictions under COVID. You need the restriction, but also you need to relax it in some, you need to leave it open in some areas in food supply chain, but not only that, for people who draw their livelihoods from daily labor, for example, you can't just impose that restriction. So limited openings for, like what Luhu suggested, corridors for food production and movement and distribution would be very essential. That's one. The second is, even when the pandemic gets to a situation where it requires total lockdown, you would need some food distribution mechanisms, especially for the most vulnerable. That is really highlighted in the presentations and in the requirements as well. So I hope this answers part of your question, but this is a critical question that requires further discussion. Last question from a guest who asked for guidelines from FAO, WHO on drafting disaster risk recovery laws. There is an international framework called Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction from 2015, adopted by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. General Assembly adopted it upon the proposal of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. But you also find a checklist of laws on disaster risk reduction developed by the UNDP and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies from 2015. In FAO, we have some related work in that area in the context of climate change, natural disaster related issues. But to the best of my mind, development of checklists and guidelines is done by these other institutions. Thank you. I think these are some of the legal questions. This is it from my side. I thank you all for your attention and for the interest.
Thanks, Sise. Belio, response to any of the questions that have been directed to you?
I think many of the questions are related to how we are going to consider for the livestock sector, and it's coming mainly from Anne. For me, during the presentation that we have touched, all the functionalities of markets should be looked at in all food systems and the value chains, including the pastoral communities. Restriction of movement is affecting the pastoral communities, and the market functionality for them will be really very essential, not only in country domestic market, even cross-border market, because this is a time that all the pastoral community and livestock sector selling sheep and goats to the Middle East market during this Ramadan fasting period and also to the Eid. So there should be a policy intervention, from the government in order to address this issue, because we have to have higher level, policy, directives in order to ease or expand, the restriction of movement and the functionalities of the market. So you are very right, on the livestock sector should not be forgotten when we are only focusing, the crop as a food commodity, but the livestock sector is also a key sector that requires, attention. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Bello. Prof, any of the questions you want to respond to? Jane?
Actually, there is a very interesting question for Jen. I'm sorry if she's gone. Sharon had asked about this food loss statistics, food waste statistics, from 30% to 14%. Maybe we can, if Jen is gone, we can ask Sharon to highlight that in 1 minute, if you allow, moderator.
Okay, thank you. Just please address that.
Okay, thank you, presenters, for this wonderful presentation from various angles. I work as a food loss economist with FAO at the headquarters in Rome. And there was, in the SOFA report for 2019, the food loss percentage was calculated and it was 14%, down from the a third food loss that was in the 2011 report. So I just wanted to know why she decided to use the old figure from 2011 and not the current one of 14% that was released last year.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I think a lot of questions have been raised in relation to implementation of the measures that have been proposed. And this is the reason why we said it's important for us to have a holistic and collaborative approach, because the government is trying as much as it can, but we need to support with ideas and with these particular interventions that we have. And the reason why we have these webinars is to generate ideas, see solutions that have worked in different parts of the world, and then to make proposals through the University of Nairobi, through FAO, to the government in relation to these particular mechanisms that can be put in place to enhance food security and to ensure that food as a right is actually protected and fulfilled as has been entrenched in the Kenyan Constitution, as well as in other international human rights instruments. It's therefore important that we continue this dialogue because we cannot find solutions in one sitting in a webinar, but we can continue the discussions to come up with ideas that can be shared with government in order for government to be able to put in place these measures to ensure that for the most vulnerable in the context of this COVID emergency, but also generally in relation to lack of the purchasing power to access food, are able to meet their food needs. So I want to thank everyone that has come in and joined the webinar. It's because of you that we have put together this team to be able to share with you their ideas so that we can collectively think about how we approach both at the individual level, at the household level, at the community level, as well as the national level, to ensure that each and every person who is in need is actually provided for or is taken care of at this particular time. I want to thank the presenters that have made time to prepare their presentations to be able to share their presentations with us, Belio, Sise, Professor Jane, and even the discussants, John and Mary. And I also want to thank the institutions that put this together, the University of Nairobi and the FAO, for this particular wonderful opportunity to share knowledge, share experiences, and look at ways that can be used to enhance the food security of the most vulnerable. I also want to thank the team that put this together, Valerie and your team, congratulations again for the wonderful opportunity of this particular framework for us to be able to share our ideas and to share knowledge with each other to be able to meet the demands of our time. So these discussions will continue. The chat will remain open. Please share your questions. I will share the slides with you. If you want them, please just drop your email address in the chat, and then we'll be able to share with you the presentations that have been presented. Thank you so much, and have a blessed day.